How you guys doing? So Miriam and I brought some of my books and shirts. We're just going to set a few out in case anybody's interested. What I'm going to be talking about is coming from my book. It's called How to Opt Out of the Technocratic State, which is available in Spanish and English and German and French. And you can download it for free on my website too. And then we have some of my other books about spirituality and freedom and all that fun stuff. Okay, I wrote some notes down because Charlotte, great job, really cool ideas, and she first was sharing with me about the Dream Factory at Envision a couple years ago. I think it's really interesting. Yeah, sure. There's some of what I don't agree with at all, and there's some really cool ideas too. We'll talk about all that in a moment. But I want to focus today, I think we called this talk Regeneration, focusing on building the parallel systems for the coming 7 generations. My work is highly focused on, like many of us, I think, what comes next, and not just like what comes next in our present moment, but embodying what our ancestors have passed on to us to think about the coming 7 generations and beyond. So how the people's lives who we will never meet are going to be shaped by the things we choose to do or not do in this very moment. And also recognizing the 7 generations going backwards, that all of the work that our ancestors had to do to get us here where we are today, and yeah, just get us to be alive, living, breathing in this moment, trying to figure out how we can keep the planet going, how we can keep humanity going, and how we might be able to actually leave something better off than what we arrived to. And some of the main focuses I'm going to talk about, besides building parallel systems, because like many of you here, I think my message and my work, first of all, for those who don't know me, I'm a freelance investigative journalist. I've been doing that for about 15 years. I'm an activist, author, documentary filmmaker, a lot of different things, public speaking, but it's all about like trying to, of course, expose the corruption in the world, show people some of the things that are happening that aren't so great, and then also, can somebody help her with the dog? He's like, just like, you okay? Yeah, he just won't chill on Pugsley. On how we can expose some of the things that aren't so great in our world, but also more importantly, try to give people solutions. So that's what I use my platform, my network, and we host events in Mexico where we live. We're building an eco-village out there that I'm going to share some of the ways we've approached these ideas of ownership and stewardship. I'll talk about that as well. But all of my work is really, yeah, just focused on building new systems. I don't think politics is the answer, violence is the answer, apathy is the answer. I don't see those as really capable of achieving lasting, true change for those 7 generations. And I also think holistically, so we're going to talk about how to kind of approach our regenerative projects, conscious projects, spiritual projects, freedom projects, whatever words you want to use, and how to actually think holistically about these things. And then 3 things came to mind while I was listening to the questions and some of the thoughts that are things that I really try to practice. And I'm sure some of it's familiar to each of us here, but hopefully we can think deeper about it today. One is living your principles. As we sit here today, does anybody, like if you were to just kind of like, let's pause for a moment and like, what is a principle that's important to you? Has anybody here, I'm sure in this crowd probably, but amongst a lot of our human family, many people might have some understanding of what that word even means, and maybe less of an understanding of what their principles actually are. Like most people walking around generally think, I'm a good person, you know, I care about the world. But when you actually get into it, not to say they're not good people, but oftentimes there's a disconnect between that image of ourselves as a good person and the way we actually live our lives. So what does a principle mean to somebody? Any definitions or ideas of what that means? Well, what is the word itself first, before we get into what our principles are? Like, what does it mean to have a principle, to hold a principle? Perfect. Yeah, so sometimes people will say first principles, like they'll refer back to like everything I do, and this is kind of how I try to live, like everything I do comes back from those first principles, right? So you have to have a foundation, and for me, some of those things, like so you said, Ray, bodily autonomy, freedom, any other ideas, like what are other important principles that you try to live your life by, or that are important in the relationships that you hold with other people? Do no harm. Do no harm, yeah. Yeah, that's a really important foundational one there. Ending exploitation, suffering. So for you, when you make your choices and the ways you try to live, like you're thinking about those things, like are your actions creating more exploitation, and how you can take steps to end or reduce that, right? Perfect. Anybody else? Any other principles or values that they hold dear?
Not toxic violence.
Yeah, cool. And obviously, yeah, go ahead, brother.
I was going to say the people and materials to finance
Just a holistic way, like how can you do that, right? And I was just going to say, obviously, in our imperfect world, that's often easier said than done because everything we do has some impact from small or big, and not always a negative impact, but we do impact everything around us just by existing, right? And so even just for one example, like we're all using laptops, including myself, some of us using cell phones. These have lithium ion batteries in them that are most likely dug up from like either Bolivia or parts of the Amazon. And we believe, and probably are, using these tools for good in the world, right? But it would be kind of difficult to maybe have a conversation with an indigenous person from the area where it's dug up and tell them, like, I promise I'm doing good things with this. It might be leaching into your water and your river, but I promise you I'm out here on the internet doing cool stuff and we're trying to make the world better. Those two things can both be true, right? We live in an imperfect situation. So living by your principles, we'll talk more about that. Also this phrase, be the change you wish to see in the world, right? Everybody's heard that. And that's probably another value that we all try to hold, right, to different degrees. And again, we don't always succeed. And I'm sure in our worst moments, we might not feel like that's not necessarily the change I want to be. But in our highest moments, we embody that. We are an example to other people of whatever that change might be. And then the other one that came to mind was voting with your dollar. You guys heard that phrase, that idea? And of course, voting with your peso, with your colones, whatever it is, like voting with your Bitcoin, whatever, you're voting with your token. There's sort of a financial component, a piece to that. But if we're thinking holistically, we're going to talk about holistic now. I do think that that concept, or at least I believe it ought to be, and I try to live this way, that we take it beyond just the finances, but like this brother was saying here, like how do we vote with our dollar in every area of our life, right? The way we eat our food, the way we communicate with ourselves. Sometimes we can be really good to the external world and really shitty to ourselves, you know, internally. We have this like negative self-talk, it's on a loop, and maybe we put ourselves down. I know I've struggled with that. Because again, when we're thinking holistically about building new systems, regenerative systems, or building parallel, counter, alternative systems, as I like to focus on, there's a lot of pieces to that puzzle, and we'll talk about some of them: finances, education, technology, health, all these different areas, which are all absolutely important, but those are only external, and there's also that internal world as well. And I think if we're going to build new systems, we also have to focus on how we create new internal dialogues with ourselves, the way we relate to each other. This is why some of us are really excited about tools like nonviolent communication or compassionate communication, or how many people have read the 4 or 5 agreements? Did you know there was a 5th agreement? There is one. Go check it out. But those books and those ideas, also another cool one that I think is great in relationships, but also just in general for relating to other humans, the 5 love languages. You guys familiar with that one? Super, super important if you're in a relationship. Check it out if you don't know about it. And these are all just ways of learning how to relate to ourselves, how to better understand ourselves, how to relate to other humans. And for me, if we don't include that aspect, that piece of the puzzle, even if we create new tokens, new permaculture systems, new farms, new off-grid, whatever, if we don't work on that aspect, we might be living in better parts of the world, or maybe living in paradise, or putting on the costume of being spiritual and being conscious and being, you know, freedom-minded people. But if we're still recreating those same internal systems and the way we relate to each other, I don't think we're actually getting as far as we can go. So let's talk more about holistic. What does that word mean to you guys? What are some definitions? There's no wrong definitions, but when you hear that, what comes to mind? Because it's a word that has been overused. You can go to the local pet store and find holistic dog food and holistic whatever, but it does have meaning. It does have an actual definition to it. Anybody? What comes to mind when you hear that? Wholeness, completeness. Yeah. You have one back there, brother?
if you're whole, then
Nothing missing if you're whole.
I think of it as like from a systems perspective rather than like deconstruction.
That's it right there. That's the real definition, right? So I mean, all these are related, but holistic, that the actual definition of it is dealing in whole systems, right? So, you know, you can apply it to pretty much any sort of skill set or any discipline, but let's like talk about the environmental sciences. If you're a scientist that's studying the riverways and the bodies of water, obviously that has value. But then there's another scientist studying the trees, and each of those disciplines are going to get important information. But somebody who takes like a holistic environmental approach, right? They're going to look at all those different pieces and how they interrelate, how they connect to each other, how they conflict with each other. And then once you have that sort of holistic view, it gives you a whole new framework to work with instead of kind of just being in this sort of narrow band. And I try to apply that to my activism. I call it holistic activism, or because I'm an anarchist, I call it holistic anarchism. And like I was saying earlier, with like living our principles, being the change we want to see in the world, voting with our dollar, expanding these ideas from just being about permaculture, or just being about crypto or blockchain, regenerative finance, or just being about the spiritual work, but kind of trying to do our best to include as many of these facets into one. And I'll share just briefly, I won't get into my whole story, but for those who know my work, before I got into journalism, I was a young, super depressed kid. I got addicted to drugs at 18, and by the time I turned 21, I was locked up in prison in Texas, where I'm originally from. And I spent 2 years just going from being the guy that was drinking as much beer bongs and shots as I could and puking everywhere, to then being pilled out, to then doing this. And then eventually I tried crystal meth, and within 10 months I was homeless, I was in the drug world, and then I was in prison. It happened pretty quickly for me. And so when I turned 21, got locked up, I really started the healing work. And while I was locked up, I started to meditate, started to get into prayer, and just really open up in a way that I had been super closed off to as a young adult, because I was just dealing with my own trauma, and the idea that there could be anything spiritual or beyond like this physical world was just insane to me. It didn't make sense to me because I was suffering so much pain. It's like, there's no way there can be a God out there if like this is allowed to happen, you know, some of the stuff that I'd gone through. But then once I found myself in this truly powerless situation of being locked up, and I ended up doing 19 months between 2005 and 2008. But the first one was the longest one. It was a full year. And, you know, that feeling of like really accepting that you're powerless. I remember after I got arrested, for like the first 2 weeks, my mom and my lawyer were trying to figure something out. Like, okay, maybe he can, you know, do some outpatient therapy and they'll let him out. And the judge was just like, no, like everything we tried, the judge was like, he needs to sit there. He has to serve this time and blah, blah, whatever. So when it finally came to like accepting, like, all right, I'm really not going anywhere. Like until these people say I can leave, I'm stuck here. I can get on the phone and call my lawyer, call my mom, cry to my girlfriend all I want. It's not going to make a damn difference. These people are not letting me leave. And that's it can be a very disempowering feeling, but it's actually in that space where I feel like I tapped in and I found my real power, because I just had to accept, like, not only because I came from a family of drug addicts and alcoholics on both sides of my family, and I grew up visiting my father in prison for his drug addiction. That was like another layer on top of like, I'm going down the same path he did. But that was like the motivation to just, for me to say, I need to figure out why I'm here. Like, what in the world brought me to this place? Why did I think taking as many drugs as possible was the answer? And what was I really running from? And all this sort of stuff. I started journaling every day. My grandma was sending me books on meditation and prayer. I started getting into Zen Buddhism in the beginning and just praying and just going within. And that was the beginning of a journey that continues to today. And so that was kind of what I would consider my first awakening. Like, I got out of prison, I went through all that. I technically, as far as the U.S. is concerned, I'm still a felon 20 years later. But it's also what led me to start researching parallel systems, because I realized, like, hey, if the mainstream system is going to reject me or judge me, then maybe I need to exist outside of that as much as possible. But when I got out of prison for the final time, October 2008, was getting out, I'm a felon, I'm reemerging to the world. As my depression had lifted, as the drugs had, you know, left my body, I rediscovered that I'm an intelligent person, that I like to learn, I like to read and understand things. And I also remembered that I generally have never trusted the government. Just like, sort of like instinctually, I was like the weird kid in elementary. I was like, I didn't really know why, I just knew there was something. I was also into punk music and metal, and a lot of the bands were like sending those messages out. I feel like the seeds were planted at a young age that now I'm like, oh, Creator had a plan the whole time. Like, it was just the seeds were being planted. But anyways, as I got out, 2009, 2010, going into 2011, the Occupy movement, I started an activist group in Houston in 2010, then Occupy happened. It was just a really active time. So I had kind of my second awakening, more related to politics and conspiracies and corruption with corporations and all this sort of stuff. And eventually that led me to get into journalism and everything I'm doing today. But it's those two experiences that really shaped me. You know, first kind of going to prison and having this personal awakening, and then later getting into activism. Also, I stopped paying taxes in the year I woke up in 2011. That was the same year I started exploring things like Bitcoin. I got into Bitcoin in 2012, 2013, and just really starting thinking of like, how do I exist outside of these systems, or how do I participate in alternative systems? In the beginning, it was like learning that there were people who were trying to create marketplaces where you could buy things in silver or gold or, barter, or just like these kind of alternatives. I learned about time banking and just all these really interesting ideas that were showing me, or even people who are trying to live without money completely. It just showed me like, okay, not everybody is accepting the sort of mainstream dominant culture as just that's all there is. And it opened my mind to like new ideas. So in that space though, for the first couple years, I'll just share this. I was living a dual life because I had my spiritual friends and I had my activist friends, and they were all very, at least at that time, I feel like this has shifted a lot in the last decade or so, which is really cool. But when I was starting my work and when I first launched this website and my books, The Conscious Resistance in 2013, there weren't so many people who seemed to be understanding the importance of freedom in the physical realm and building new systems in the physical realm, as well as bringing in the spiritual side. Like a lot of my activist friends, we would go to protests, we would go to marches, rallies, do all the typical activist stuff. We'd be out on the street holding signs. But if I tried to talk to them about some deeper spiritual awakening I was going through, or something really profound, they just like, what are you talking about, hippie? What do you just like, hey, you guys want to come to the meditation this weekend? We're going to be doing this super deep thing. We're going to activate our chakras or whatever it was. And they were just super logical, rational kind of activist minds, right? And then I would go to my spiritual friends who were open to those ideas, obviously, and we're doing our meditations and our ecstatic dances and whatever else. And I'd try to get them involved in the activism. And I'd say, there was a police shooting this weekend. Did you guys hear about it? We're going to march this weekend. And they'd say, don't talk about it. You're going to manifest it. Only good vibes here. Like, just only chill stuff. And so for the first couple years, I was like, all right, I guess I got this world and I got this world. But eventually it came to me again, that phrase, the conscious resistance, which I just consider that to be the realization, the understanding, the recognition that the struggle for a more free, ethical, and a just world won't come from only confronting the physical institutions of power. That's obviously part of it, like exposing corruption. I've tried to take on that role. Corporations, helping people understand the dangers of these systems and where they're flawed and where they've gone wrong. But then there's also that other aspect, which I call the struggle against our own internal tyrant. It's our doubts, our fears, our insecurities, and our limiting beliefs, which often can hold us back and prevent us from being the best versions of ourselves. And I definitely think that the planet and the creator is calling on us to be the best versions of ourselves right now, to step up to the plate and really like, what are your gifts? What are your skills? We need them right now. We need you like shining bright and contributing whatever you have to offer. So for me, that's what the conscious resistance is bringing those two things together. It's not just saying, I'm going to meditate and pray and only focus on the internal work and completely ignore that there is a physical realm that does exist, that does affect me and does impact me as much as we maybe like it not to. And it's also not saying that I'm going to be so rooted and distracted by what is trending on social media or what latest thing I should be outraged by or what the government and corporations are up to, and then completely ignore my internal world, right? It's like the balancing of these two things. So I think that's really, really important for us to consider. And again, for me, this is just part of being a whole, like trying to think holistically. We can't really, at least in my view, you can't really have one without the other. And we all have blind spots. There's all areas to improve. So I'm not sitting here saying like I've got all this shit figured out or anything like that. So holistic. We're going to talk about exit and build in a moment and some parallel systems. I wanted to get into some fun stuff though around ownership and stewardship, and then tell you guys a little bit about our community that we're building in Mexico, and sort of how we've approached some of these ideas, which aren't so different, but I do absolutely support, and I wrote about in this book when I first described the Conscious Agora, which is the name of our community, believe in stewardship, and that is an important ethic and value, sort of, because my family is indigenous to Texas, and my father's side is Czech and Native, most likely Seminole from what I've learned. And we've been blessed to get to go to Sundance and ceremony and dance with the Choctaw and learn from the Lakota. And we are taught that, hey, prior to private property ownership, like we just existed on the land. In fact, we didn't even have these different names. Like John Trudell used to just say, we were just a people. We were just the people on the land. Then later on, we started to separate, and so I needed to give you a name so I could understand who you were, but ultimately, we were just the people. And especially we're talking about from the top of all the way to northern Canada down to southern Chile, this was just a big-ass piece of land with a lot of different indigenous people on it. And they were separated by mountains and rivers and things like that, natural borders, but for the most part, it was just the people existing on this part of the planet, living indigenous, right? And most of those people were not operating from a mindset of like, carving up the land and claiming it as their own. Many of them were nomadic, so it was completely different. So I take a lot of inspiration from that. And I also find myself asking, though, it's like, things have changed, though. Things have completely changed. And I believe there is a place for private property and for private ownership of land, even if we call it stewardship, because at the end of the day, all that really entails is that somebody else can't come take it from you. Like you were talking about people who want to, whether it's the World Economic Forum or BlackRock or whoever else, if that property is not claimed, owned, or stewarded by people like us who are like-minded, others will come take it, and they will deforest it, and they will turn it into a strip mall, they will turn it into whatever, right? So I think that there's a fine line and a fine balance, but that we shouldn't necessarily shun the idea of ownership completely, and especially even to talk more, like who has heard of that phrase that Mama Ray mentioned earlier, you will own nothing and be happy? Are people familiar with that? If not, I can, okay, I saw only three hands, so I'm gonna mention what that means a little bit. Just real briefly, and if this sounds conspiratorial to you, just hold on to your hats. We'll be all right. In June 2020, the World Economic Forum, which is a group that has existed since the 1970s, and they meet every January in Davos, Switzerland. And this is like heads of state, prime ministers, presidents, media people, academics, just a whole range of what some people might term the quote unquote elite of the world, right? They get together for a week and every January in Davos, and they discuss all kinds of concepts, many of which might appeal to us. My problem, and I think many of our problems with them, is that they come from this sort of top-down perspective where they think like, well, we are all in this position, we have the wealth, we have the money, so we should decide sort of what the next stage of humanity is. And I have a big problem with that. And so they've been around for a long time. Most people have not been paying attention to them. They have their annual meetings. They put out white papers that most people ignore. The problem is we ignore them, but often these plans and these ideas they put out turn into reality, because when folks like them get together, powerful people get together, and they claim it's sort of unofficial business, it's not official government business, oftentimes the things that they predict or that they say should happen end up becoming reality. And it's like the people like us, and especially indigenous people, their voices are left out of the conversation. We don't even have a seat at the table for the most part. So in June 2020, a couple months after what I like to call COVID 1984 started, the World Economic Forum put out a video that said, welcome to 2030, I own nothing, I have no privacy, life has never been better. And part of that phrase was, you will own nothing and you will be happy. And so it was actually based on a 2016 essay that was written by a Danish politician, and she wrote this essay, which in her view I think was meant to describe a utopia, but I think many of us would probably consider it to be dystopian. But again, they tried to sort of glamorize these concepts of lack of ownership. Like she says basically, sometimes I miss having privacy, but now we don't, and she's like, sometimes I miss privacy, sometimes I miss owning things, but now I don't need to own anything anymore because drones deliver everything to my doorstep. And anytime I want to go anywhere, I can just call, Uber, a driverless vehicle to pick me up and take me places, and I just rent all my appliances. And this is becoming more and more popular. And again, in some cases, I think this can work. Like maybe every community doesn't need a chainsaw. And so you have like a local share shed where people get to borrow and use tools, right? There's some good value to this. But also, ultimately, it's seeding this idea that us owning things individually is a problem or is bad. And I think that can go some very dangerous places. So I just want us to play with that idea in our mind of like, there's value to maybe saying, yeah, we don't all need 30 of the same exact thing. And if we're living in a community, we can find a way to share that or to have it communally owned or unowned or stewarded, whatever language you want to use. But at the same time, I don't think we should look negatively on people who choose to own a vehicle, who choose to get a piece of property and say, I own this and I'm going to do something good with it, right? I think there's a lot of different concepts, and what we were hearing about from the last presentation, I think brings in some really cool ideas. So I want to share like a little bit about how, and I love that you mentioned like no absentee ownership, because I think that's a big problem too, is like people who will come and buy a property and they never live there and they don't have anything to do with it, but it's like they've claimed it. Now that I think, gets into some philosophical discussions. We explore these ideas in my book, like how do you, basically the essay is called, propertarians, people who believe in property and people who don't, can they coexist? How do those people have land next to each other? What do the borders look like? How do we explore? Because I do think we need to get beyond some of these ideas, and I talk in there about the idea of decentralized borders, but that's a whole nother conversation. So in Mexico, we have a property, Miriam and I, we actually just paid off the land last month, so that's really exciting. And it's 23 acres. It's got banana trees, avocado trees, lime, pears, pomegranate, wild berries. It's got 2 ojos de agua. It's got like a nice, not a full-on river, but a stream that's pretty wide and deep at some points. that we're exploring more and more as one of the east and the southern border. And it's got a pond on there, and it's got a few little shelters, but we haven't started building our homes or anything. But our goal is essentially to combine elements of a retreat center, hosting workshop, hosting PDCs and stuff like that, but also we're going to live there. There is going to be, this is one thing that I think might be different from some of the communities we visited, is like we actually do want to have people living there. We plan to have a village of essentially a freedom cell, which I'll talk about more, 8 to 10 homes, households, whether that's couples, individuals. And the really cool thing is we've been attracting like a really diverse group of people. So like 2 of our most recent members are in their early 70s. Miriam's in her early 30s. I just turned 40. I think another gentleman in his mid 40s, 30s. So there's kind of a good range, Canadians, Americans, Mexicans. And we're isolated in a mountain about an hour and a half outside of the main city where we live. Our only neighbors are people who have lived on that mountain their entire life and are from that part of the mountain, which is really important to us because we're personally not interested in the slightest of creating any kind of expat bubble. It's actually why we like this part of Mexico, because there's not many expats and there's not much English spoken at all. And so we are, bringing people from elsewhere, but we want people who speak Spanish. We want people who understand that this is not going to be a place to escape Mexico. You're going to be integrated into Mexico. Our neighbors who, like we have it's a 23-acre land. It's basically a rectangle, and there's a 1-acre cutout where our most immediate neighbor, his name's Rigoberto, he's been the caretaker of that property for the last 8 years before we even came along. And so we've let him know, like, we want you to be an integral part of the community. He knows the trees and everything better than us. And all those beautiful trees I mentioned, this is one of the things that drew us there, because the previous owner had already installed drip lines all over the entire property, and there's no pump. It's all gravity fed from the mountain. So the mountain itself, this area is filled with springs and water. So the mountain itself is just feeding all the trees, and we just want to bring more. We just want to bring more food forest, and we want to work with Rigoberto and his brothers and his family and have them be integrated into our community as we live there, and then also use it as a space to host and teach a lot of the concepts that I talk about in my work and that I think many of us are interested in. And right now it is in Miriam's name. Miriam's first generation, born in the US, her family's from Mexico. So it just made sense for us right now as we're getting our group together. We've got what we call our founding family. Those are the group of people that I'll just share the story briefly. In October 2020, after COVID-1984 began, Miriam and I went to Mexico to just watch from a distance, because I had suspicions based on my work. A lot of my journalism is focused on digital privacy. So I've been warning about, like, I first released this book in 2019 talking about digital IDs, facial recognition, social credit scores, things that more and more people are paying attention now because of what we saw during COVID, with some countries being very extreme. And some of those ideas have stuck around. And unfortunately, when governments use those ideas, as much as they promise that it's going to be convenient and easy and helpful, it can also lead to a world where there's very little privacy and there's very little liberty in the long term, and where your accounts can be shut off if it's all digital money, if it's all digital IDs, and if everything's connected through facial recognition cameras. So I've been warning about these ideas for a long time. And when we came back from our annual trip to Mexico and Costa Rica in February 2020, I was telling Miriam, there's something weird going on in China. I've been watching. I'm not sure what's going to happen. And we got back to Texas just in time to see the toilet paper running out. And we knew something wasn't right. So we decided to load up her car, her Jeep, and just head to Mexico and visit her family. And, like, let's just wait. And we'd never been to Morelia. We'd never been to that part of the country. But that's just where creator synchronicity pulled us. We ended up loving the area, meeting friends who happened to be a real estate agent who helped us find the land and all this beautiful stuff. And so when we were first opening this idea, like, all right, I'm actually going to try to build the idea that I wrote about in my book back in 2017. We're going to build the Conscious Agora. I sent that out through my network, and we had about 500 responses from people all around the world. And we're like, okay, there's some interest here. So Miriam and I put together a questionnaire, just super basic at the time. We sent that back to everybody. We got about 200 responses, and we went through every single one, and we narrowed it down to 50 people to start with. And in November 2020, we started having bi-weekly calls, just getting to know each other. And it was a super basic questionnaire at the time. We've since refined it as we've got more clear on what our vision is and what exactly we're looking for. But it was really cool. We just started getting to know these folks, and it just naturally, from October 2020 till May 2023, when we first put the payment down on the property, went from 50, 45, 30 something, 27, 14, and then eventually 4 households. And once we got to that point, we decided this is our founding family. We're not going to add anybody else for a while. And that was summer 2023. And we decided since that time to just focus on getting all of our documentation together. Things we'd already been working with the bigger group, but now it's like, all right, we've all been through some shit together now. this is, we're looking around, it's like, hey, we've all stuck through it. We love this idea. Let's make this property happen. We put some money down, and then we focused on putting together our decision-making agreements, our conflict resolution agreements, our entry and exit process. How do people join? How do people leave? All this fun stuff, right? And much of it we've taken from visiting many different communities in Mexico, the US, Costa Rica, and elsewhere, even now in the UK and Denmark, and learning from how other people approach things, taking inspiration, and also taking things like noticing what we don't like and what doesn't work for us, because ultimately it's not about a judgment on anybody else's community. It's about each of us getting more clear on our visions and learning, what do I want to live in, right? They're doing it this really awesome way. That doesn't appeal to me so much. Okay, let's take this idea. How can we modify that, adapt it to our needs, et cetera, et cetera. And that's really what I think this is, like all the different communities in Costa Rica and around the world that we can do is take inspiration from each other. And I do think in the long term, as we're building these parallel systems, at least as I'm focused on that many of these communities are going to end up becoming trade partners. Like if the world, at least part of the world, does go more dystopian, we will have the opportunity to continue to exchange not only ideas, but I think goods and services in the long term. But that's a sort of bigger vision. But so we started with all the decision making, conflict resolution, and everything, and then we got to the point this last summer, August 2024, where we opened back up the community and said, all right, we're ready to start taking in new applications. We got a bunch of applications. And then we started doing the process that we just developed. They're like, all right, you guys are going to be the test people for us. It's the first time we're actually trying to go through it. We call our new incoming members activators. And we actually use the permaculture zones as a way to kind of model incoming people. Like zone 0 is us, the founding family. And then as people come in, they kind of progress towards the zones of joining. And so we started with 7 or 8 households last summer. And like I said, just a couple months ago, 2 of them have now joined. And we're still vetting about 5 more. We're about to bring 4 more in. And all we basically do is we do weekly calls and we do group exercises. We do use the book Creating a Life Together as some of the exercises in there as kind of inspiration. And then just different things we've come up with or learned from other communities. And then, of course, getting to meet face-to-face is a big part of that too. So we host an event every January in Mexico called the People's Reset, which I would love to see all of you at next year. I think you would all really enjoy it. It's a 5-day solutions-focused event. It's completely solutions focused. There's not a single discussion about the problems of the world. One day is totally dedicated to health, mental, physical, spiritual health. One day is all permaculture and food independence. One day is all parallel systems, homeschooling, finance, etc. There's a whole day dedicated to decentralized technologies. And then the final day is called Building Free and Conscious Communities. And that's where we try to highlight people who are either already living in community and they get to come share about their projects. Like this year we had a woman come speak about their community from Finland. We had a gentleman speak about their community in the Yucatan in Mexico, and then some people talk about what they're doing in Mexico or in Texas. And then sometimes also just speaking about how they organize within their community. We also had people talking about home birthing, just like a big range of ideas, but it's all solutions focused. And by the way, we also put out all those talks for free. So if you go to thepeoplesreset.org, if you go to our Odyssey channel, which is a blockchain-based censorship-proof video platform, all of the talks we've organized since January 2021 are available for free. We also have a Spanish channel where all of the talks from the last 3 events are available in Spanish for free as well. And that's just really important for us. So I think we probably have the world's largest database of solutions-focused talks. It's over 120 hours at this point. And we also did our first event in the UK a couple months back. All those talks can be found for free. So I just mentioned that to say, like, sort of what we're doing with our event and what we're doing with our land is kind of all intersected. The event happens in Morelia where we live. Our land's an hour and a half outside the city. And if everything goes well, by next year, we'll be doing our first retreat after the main event, sort of smaller decompression with real intimate, 15 to 20 people, come visit the land and let's go deeper with these ideas. And now as far as like the ownership situation, I did want to just kind of explore that because I know that there's like discussions around trust and what Prosperous Legacy Advisors are doing, and I just love that everybody's exploring all these different ideas. And for us, we're definitely learning and seeing what is everybody else doing, does it fit our situation. But Mexico is actually really unique because the Mexican Revolution was only 100 years ago. There's still some of that spirit alive in parts of the country. In fact, without getting too derailed, there is a town 2.5 hours away from us that is about to celebrate their 14th year of being completely free. And in 2011, they declared themselves autonomous. They kicked out the cartels, the cops. They banned all political parties. And they were recognized as an autonomous region, mainly because they are largely indigenous. And they did it out of survival, not because they're like radical anarchists or something. They did what they had to do to survive. And now it's been going on 14 years of them kind of claiming back their property. And that spirit is very alive in the area we're at. And so we take inspiration from them. And these are not, again, these are just like small indigenous grandmothers and grandpas who just like, and actually you guys might like this part of the story, their forest was being logged, and the whole reason the shit went down, they didn't have some grand plan. It literally just happened one day. Their forest was being logged, their water supply was being screwed up, women had gone missing. One of the men asked these loggers who were working with the corrupt cops and the cartel, you know, why are you doing this to us? And they said, we're coming for your women and children next. And then one day, 13 women decided to block the trucks. And we're like, you're not doing this anymore. Guns got drawn. One of the community members got shot in the eye. He lived, but that was sort of the spark. And then everybody starts grabbing sticks and stones. Before you know it, they'd taken these guys hostage. They took their guns. They didn't know what they were doing. This was just like spur of the moment. But after a while, they'd taken a few guys hostage. They had a few guns. I did a documentary on this. It's on my website. They took us to the tree where they were hanging the guys from. They would like hang them up and then let them down, and hang them up and let them down. And they were like, there's a lot of anger in that community, of course, after everything they've been through. But ultimately, they got together and they decided, we don't want blood on our hands. Like they had made a makeshift jail in the church for a little while. It became national news. The federal government got involved and was like, just release them. We promise they'll be held accountable. They chose to do that. Of course, nobody was ever held accountable. But either way, the federal government ended up recognizing them as autonomous, and they were able to set their own rules. And this is really interesting to me because it's kind of foreign for many of us who come from Western countries. But in this part of Mexico and in many parts of rural Mexico, the politicians didn't even bother to go campaign there, right? So they'd only started campaigning there in the last 30, 40 years. So there was people alive who were member before the political parties, and they were like, before the politicians came, you were my neighbor, but now you're red and I'm blue, and we're divided and we're hating on each other. So that was one of their first things, is to ban the political parties. So whenever there's elections going on, none of the state or local or feds can come into their town and like, do their whole spiel. And it's not a perfect situation. They're still learning, but I do take a lot of inspiration from that. Anyway, so the revolution was about 100 years ago, and after the revolution, they were on, like much of Central and Latin America, the hacienda system, and so the land got redistributed. And so, you have the ejido system in Mexico, which is like collective ownership of land, where a lot of families were gifted land. And so, like, you might be a Mexican living today, and you're like, yeah, my family's got land, I've never been there, but it's somewhere over there. It might not be great land, but it was distributed after the revolution. So you have private property ownership, and you have ejido land. And you can own both of those, but there can be complications, like many foreigners, and foreigners can own land in Mexico. You just can't own near the 50 miles of the border, the coast, or anything like that. But sometimes people have come in and they bought land. They didn't realize it was ejido land. And then later on, a family member comes back and can claim that and then take it from them. So people will have horror stories sometimes about Mexico, but it's just a more complicated process where if you're going to try to buy ejido land, you have to literally go to every living family member and get them to sign off and say, I no longer claim this, right? And if you don't do that, then yeah, some random uncle can show up, 30 years after you've been living there and building. So needless to say, we didn't do that. We decided to just find property that could be where we could get the deed and own it outright. And as we've been exploring, like I mentioned, right now it's just in Miriam's name as we're figuring out our next moves. But the long-term goal is to do something like what we're hearing, whether it's trust, whether it's something similar to Dream Factory or elsewhere. But what we're really leaning toward, there's two different types of organizations. There's more, but the two that are appealing to us, one is just the civil association, one is a socialist association. And the civil association seems most in line with what we're doing because it's essentially a club that you can form. This club is registered with the Mexican government, but it can be a soccer club. It can be like anything. It can be, in fact, it's interesting because the law specifically says it can be a club designed to defend human rights, to protect the ecology, which is really aligned with what we're trying to do. And so you form this club, and in our case, the club will be called the Conscious Agora, and the club owns that land, right? But then also you have to have certain, members, whether it's like treasurer, officers, et cetera. You do have to have some sort of structure that the government knows about. And our goal is generally to give them as little information as possible and kind of handle it all internally. But the way it's going to work is each of our members are going to be members of this club. And as your membership, you get plot A, you get plot B, whatever. And so you will still have like a legal ownership of your plot that you can build whatever you want on our house, in your house and in your little thing. But then at the same time, we all get communal access to the fruit trees, to the water and everything else. So we're trying to combine both elements of that because I will say for myself and for most of our group, we're very strong individualists. We believe in individual liberty as a very important value. I also believe in collective liberation, but I don't believe in putting the collective above the individual. I think that has led to a lot of horrific things in history. And so how do we find that balance, right? In our interest of coming together in community, but also I want my privacy in my little house and I want to be able to do my thing, but I want to work with you, on projects. And so that's been something we've spent a lot of time and discussion around, like finding that weaving of, we're going to have, because like, for example, in the beginning, when we were first working with our bigger group and we were walking the land, we're like, okay, somebody's like, oh, I want my house right here. And it's like in the middle of the fruit orchard. And that kind of brought up conversations like, okay, so if you build your house there, do you own all those trees around there? And then that just sort of started to get messy where it's like, well, no, I mean, these trees are all here. We want to bring more. We don't necessarily want your house and your ownership of that to take that away from everybody else. And so ultimately we decided on sort of where we're going to put our village at. So we'll have homes kind of, it's like 3 levels. And so the homes will be focused on there, the village there. And then we'll have a holistic education center where we can teach and have community kitchen and stuff like that and have workshop space. But as I said earlier, everybody gets access to the water. Everybody gets access to the fruit trees and all that sort of stuff. But again, it's still within that scope of, we do believe in the ownership of the conscious agora is going to own that land. Now, mentally, we're going to think of ourselves as stewards, right? We're not going to just, like, we're just here to exploit the land. We're here to it's only here to serve our purpose. That's been another big conversation for us because we're not a vegan community. I am vegan and some of our members are vegan, but we didn't want to, me and Miriam knew from the beginning, we didn't want to create a vegan community. A lot of vegans can be a lot to handle. and I say that as a vegan who doesn't hang out with a lot of other vegans. So we're like, how do we find that balance though, right? We've got vegans, we got meat eaters in here, and it was a lot of discussion. And again, the more clear we got, some people left because they decided, all right, the agreement you guys came to, I'm glad y'all found that, but that's not what I'm looking for. And there's been no harm, no hard feelings or anything. We're friends with all these people. Ultimately, we want them to get where they're going, and we want to get more clear about where we're going. What we ended up deciding was that, for one, every animal brought on the property, whether it's a dog or cat, like a pet, or a work animal, a donkey, we do have an awesome donkey there, that it would be taken on a case-by-case basis. Like the decision makers of the group will talk about that, like how we feel about this. And because we've seen from visiting a lot of communities, animals are often one of the biggest contention points. Your dog is eating my chickens. He won't stop shitting on my lawn. He never shuts up barking. Like whatever it is, animals can just be a huge conflict point for a lot of people. So we had that, but then also, okay, what about the vegan side of things? We came to the agreement that in the communal kitchen, all the meals will be vegetarian, and then that any animal that's brought on the property can't be slaughtered. So if you bring a chicken, if we're bringing chickens because we want to help them, get them to help fertilize the ground, or goats for different purposes, we can't, because we started to have that dialogue, well, we're going to get close to these animals. And then what, a week later, we're going to be sitting down and you're going to be eating that animal? Like, so you can eat whatever you want in your own home, whether you're a meat eater or a vegan. And of course, we have neighbors who do butcher animals, and there's there's opportunity to get that. It's just that we don't want any of the animals that are specifically coming onto the property. Again, they can't just be to serve our human needs. So the donkey's not being taken care of, and we just pull him out every now and then when we need work or something like that. And like, no, he needs to be essentially a member of the community and treated as such. And yeah, so that was the compromise that we came to. And about 7 people left after that. Not like an angry thing, but they were like, hey, for me, I want to be able to slaughter my animals. That's a really important thing to me. So this isn't going to be the community for me. And that's great. We wish them well, and they're still doing their thing. And so since that, again, as we've gotten more clear on that, we've been able to figure out what works for us. So back to the civil association. The civil association is kind of, it seems to have elements of like a trust or what people associate with a PMA, but it is registered with the government. And that is a very difficult thing for me to do, but I feel like, and again, we haven't done it yet, but I feel like it does serve our purposes best because it'll be registered with the government in at least a minimum way that we know that we exist. This sort of organization, as we've learned, is able to receive donations that people can get tax deductible. So if somebody wanted to support the Conscious Agora through this process, they can deduct it from their taxes. And also, once you become a civil association, you don't have to pay taxes anymore. So the club would not have to pay taxes on the land at all. So we're still figuring that part out, but I just wanted to share that idea and kind of how we're sort of approaching this ownership, stewardship, balancing individuals with community and privacy and all that fun stuff. I'm going to just talk about a couple more things and I'll wrap up, guys. So everything that I just discussed is really a part of a strategy that I discuss in my book, which I don't know if I mentioned earlier, but you can download the book for free at my website, theconsciousresistance.com/how-to. There's a free audio book and the free PDF there as well if you want to check it out. is coming from what I call exit and build. It's just this idea that, like we were talking about earlier, living with our principles, being the change we want to see, voting with our dollar. If we see systems that don't align with those principles and don't align with those values, I personally don't think we should continue to participate in them. Or at the very least, we should strive to see what steps can we start to take to get away from them instead of just compromising ourselves and accepting, okay, well, I'm just going to participate in an immoral system because that's the way the world is. I don't think if most of us would be where we are now if we accepted the world as, as the way it is, right? But then each of us make exceptions and compromises. And like I said earlier, it's an imperfect world, so sometimes we do have to make compromises. But I do think if we strive to live within our principles and to be the change we wish to see and to vote with our dollar, there are ways we can do this, going back to holistic. So exit and build is you see a system that doesn't align with your values. I'll start with the simplest one, which is technology. This is a fun one too because I think it's such an easy one and it takes time too. So there's all kinds of reasons to not want to use Google, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon. I'm sure you guys can think of your own reasons for that. I could give you a whole bunch. But I think you guys probably have some things come to mind. Well, let's just mention one. Like, I mean, some of these big companies, for example, has anybody heard of the Lavender AI program? It's a program that helps drones become more efficient, especially in Gaza, and is developed by some of these big tech companies, including Google and others. So I see that, and that alone is a reason for me to like, I don't want to use Google search engine anymore. I don't want to use Google Maps. I haven't used Google Drive or any of that stuff in years. But I go, and again, this is not a judgment on anybody, this community or anywhere else. It's just my observation, so take it how you will. But I go to a lot of beautiful conscious space, spiritual spaces, freedom spaces, regenerative spaces, and everybody's on Google Docs. Everybody's using Zoom. Everybody's using Microsoft Teams. And it's just important for us to recognize there are alternatives to every single one of those things that do the exact same thing, sometimes better, that don't track you, that don't trace you, and at the most important, are more in line with your values that we all said we have, the principles we have. NoMoreGoogle.com is a great resource. PrivacyTools.io is another really good one. TakeBackOurTech.org is my friend's website, and he does a bunch of different webinars and walkthroughs to help people get off, like Microsoft and some of the mainstream platforms, get on Linux, learn how to use alternative search engines, learn how to use, alternative to Google Maps, because they all exist. It's just that you're not going to hear about them when you go to the mainstream electronics store. You're not going to hear about them, just like we know that we can't necessarily trust the mainstream media to tell us the truth about the world. You can't trust the mainstream businesses to tell you that there are alternative companies out there. My friend who runs Take Back Our Tech, he has a phone and he does laptops called the Above Phone, abovephone.com. Miriam has one, Ray has one, Elias has one. And these are de-Googled phones, so I mean anybody who wants to take the time can figure out how to do that themselves. But if you don't want to, it's really cool because they sell the phones de-Googled, but they also sell them preloaded with all these open source decentralized apps that are the alternatives to the mainstream ones you're using. So instead of YouTube, you can watch all those videos without having an account or Google tracking you with NewPipe. If you want to listen to podcasts without having an account on Apple, Spotify, etc., you can download AntennaPod. If you want to use an alternative to Google Maps, there's Organic Maps, there's Magic Earth. My point is that there are alternatives that exist to every single one of these steps. And like, for example, when we organize our event, we send out forms, just like everybody uses forms with Google, but we use CryptPad, CryptPad. And the one I use is cryptpad.fr. There's a bunch of different instances you could check out, but it has everything you're doing. It has documents, it has sheets, it's got forms, everything you're used to with Google, but not Google. And I think it's really important. This is just one example. I'm talking about exit and build. So we see that there's a system that doesn't align with our values. The idea is let's exit from that system and build new ones, or in this case, support those who are building new ones. Because I'm not a technologist, I'm not a software engineer, I'm not a coder, I'm not a developer. I just work with some, I get to meet awesome people, and every time I learn about somebody's new cool project, I want to like shout it from the rooftops and support it. Because unfortunately, a lot of these new, as you guys know, in the sort of regenerative space, there can be the best new idea that could change the world, but if it doesn't get support, it's going to be gone in a year or less maybe. Sometimes these beautiful ideas, they come and they pop up and it's like, wow, this thing could revolutionize this space or the music industry. Like I got a friend who created SoulStream, and it's an alternative to Spotify, and it has all these great features, but nobody's ever heard about it, and he's like struggling to keep it going, right? So it's important, I think, for us to support those who are trying to build those new systems. So we exit from systems that don't align with our values, and we build and or support those who are building new alternative parallel systems. Now, to talk about this in a holistic way, like I mentioned earlier, that's just the technology piece. We could also talk about the food piece, which is, I think, most of us here understand. If you're interested in permaculture, you know about permaculture. You understand the mainstream food production and distribution systems are unsustainable, wasteful, et cetera, et cetera. We can go on and on about them, right? So we don't want to participate in that. So we try to support local farmers where we can. We go to farmers markets when we can. Maybe you do community support agriculture, stuff like that, right? So you're exiting from that old system that you know that doesn't align with your values, and you're trying to build or support new ones. That's just the general concept, and I try to apply it like every area of my life: food, technology, health. There's one big one. Oh, money, of course, like finance is the other big aspect. People are talking about tokens and Bitcoin, and I've been using, as I mentioned earlier, Bitcoin since 2012. I was one of those people that was in there when the space was still very revolutionary. A lot of people who've got into crypto, and especially Bitcoin the last few years, are mainly focused on what they call number go up. Like, the higher the number, the more rich I am, the better off I am. They're not thinking like, oh my God, this could defeat the central banks. This could be a new way outside of government money and debt slavery and fiat currency and fractional reserve. But that was the ethos in the beginning. It was sort of like happening at the same time. If you remember back 2008 financial collapse, the Bitcoin white paper came shortly after that. Then the Occupy movement, then the Fed movement in the United States. Like there was a lot of people waking up that like the economic system was not working for the people. And in that space, that's where many of us came into Bitcoin and came into the space like, oh my God, here's a tool. This is like outside of the government's hand. Before that, we were just trying to do silver dollars or barter or other things. And those all still have value, but this was like a brand new tool that, you know, couldn't be stopped, and it might disrupt that. And so I remember that excitement, and then seeing over time how it's become, as it's become more mainstream and well known, it's also now there's a lot of people who've never actually held their own Bitcoin in their own wallet with their own keys. They just host it on some mainstream exchange, or now they're just treating it like it's a stock or something like that. You know, that to me is not at all the ethos that I want to be involved with or participate in. Like, these tools for me were absolutely meant to be revolutionary tools. Like, and whether it's Bitcoin, I also love Monero because of the privacy aspects. But whatever it is, whether we create some new tokens or it's a paper currency, because there's also a really cool alternative. They don't really call it a currency, but it would fit the definition in Mexico called the tumen, which is mainly an indigenous thing, and it's starting to spread around the country. And they have these like little physical cards. They make really awesome art, and you know, you imagine like a marketplace where everybody's accepting it, and they know they can take it and use it elsewhere. So it doesn't even have to be digital. But the point is like getting out of these old legacy systems that we know do not align with our values. And for me, another big piece of that, the reason I don't use banks, and I haven't used the bank since 2008, is because, like, has anybody looked at the internet in the last 24 hours? Just curious. If you might see that Jeffrey Epstein's back in the news right now. There's like talk. Okay, so one person dipped out and saw what's going on in the real world, right? I just bring that up to say Jeffrey Epstein used big banks like J.P. Morgan Chase to launder the money that he used to abuse his victims. So why would we want to put our money in that bank? Bank of America robbed the American people, and people all around the world, really. Like these different big banks, and you could talk about the same banks in Costa Rica and Mexico. They've all got things that I would say if we went around this room, each of us would probably be like, I don't want to be associated with that. Yet many of us give them our money to hold and to use and things like that. That to me isn't living within your principles, isn't being the change you wish to see, isn't voting with your dollar, right? So if we're talking about thinking holistically, to me, those pieces are important. So exiting from the financial, the aspects of the financial system that don't align with your values, the food system, the technology aspect, healthcare systems, you could go on. And I encourage each of you in your own time and quiet space to sit down and think of the different systems that you're sort of participating in, and then to see like, yeah, that's not really in line with my values. It's not meant to like, hey, you're living wrong, shame yourself, but come up with a plan. Come up with a 6-month plan, a 1-year plan. Like, let's say you got student loan debt, credit card debt, your money's in one of the big banks right now. The first step you could do is move to a smaller local bank or a credit union, something like that, right? So you're not totally out of the system yet, but you're taking the step away. You're exiting bit by bit. It's not going to happen overnight. And of course, also, we're each going to have different end goals. Like to me, I'm trying to be as much in the new parallel systems and create them, because I think what we're laying right now is going to be the foundation for what will come, and that's going to be really important back to those 7 generations we talked about earlier. But it doesn't happen overnight. So you start to see what areas of your life might be out of alignment with what you actually believe, what your highest ideal is. But don't just get down on yourself and, oh God, I'm such a horrible person. Come up with an action plan, right? And then start taking steps to do that. That's what I call exit and build. That's what I write about in my book. And and we go much deeper into like some action step ideas. And yeah, and all of this for me goes back to the idea of building parallel systems, thinking holistically, trying to live in line with our values on a day-to-day basis. And the last piece of this is probably the most important piece, and that is thinking about exiting and building from those unhealthy mindsets and limiting beliefs that I mentioned earlier. I just shared briefly about like my struggle with depression and suicide and drug abuse and going to prison at 20 years old. Like I had to do a lot of healing, and it continues today. And I always come back to that because I just know even if we create new financial systems, new regenerative permaculture communities, et cetera, all the things we just went over, new technological tools, if we don't do that internal work, it might take a couple generations. But you know, if you look at that root word of revolution, it's revolve, right? We're gonna keep revolving, keep going this cycle of samsara, like over and over, and just never stepping out of it until we, as beautiful, powerful, free humans, can actually exit from those unhealthy traumas and things that we picked up or absorbed in these programming, and build and support new ways of thinking, the way we relate to each other, the way we have, relate to ourselves. Because oftentimes we have a lot of negative self-talk. I know for myself, it's okay, it's all. I know I struggled with a lot of negative self-talk over the years. That was like my biggest challenge. Like I had a lot of supportive people around me, and it was always me inside beating myself up, talking all this crazy shit. And I had to find ways through that. So I just want to kind of bring it back to that all these different systems, food, finance, technology, the healthcare piece, and we could go on and on, are absolutely important. But like I said earlier with the conscious resistance, we have the physical realm, and we need to build new systems. We need to, I strive to expose power and try to show people the problem so we can focus on the solutions. But the ultimate solution starts right here, right? And even bringing it back to permaculture zones, right? You have zone 1, this is the garden you tend to every day, zone 2, 3, and on. But zone 0 is yourself, your own heart, your own mind. And if we don't tend to that garden, I don't know if we are going to create that better world. So thank you guys. Appreciate you. And we'll just leave our stuff out for a bit. If anybody at any point wants to come say hi or talk about the books or shirts, I don't want to interrupt what's going on next, but we'll have it out.
I want to say non-permissioned advertising. We have amazing chocolate grown by Daniel here. If you want some, you can